There are some moments in life that mark a before and after. The same is true for comics, and Crisis on Infinite Earths is one of those moments. Back in the 80s, it completely reset the DC universe, and now, in 2019, it's about to reset the Arrowverse and maybe the rest of DC on screen. How exactly will DC clean up and streamline the mess they've made? Today at The Binger, we'll be explaining DC's past and how it could shape their future. At this point, we all know that the upcoming Arrowverse crossover Crisis on Infinite Earths was originally a series of comics published 30 years ago. But why are they bringing back this specific storyline right now? To explain that, we have to go way back, past the 1980s all the way to the 1960s. In September 1961, DC released The Flash number 123, otherwise known as The Flash of Two Worlds. The issue's cover advertised it as a, quote, spectacular story that is sure to become a classic. And although this isn't exactly false advertising, the comic's legacy has been, in a word, complicated. Although the cosmic construct of the DC multiverse began earlier, with the Justice Society of America in 1940 and the mirror universe of Wonder Woman number 59, The Flash of Two Worlds is what started DC's Infinite Earth issues. The intention wasn't to bring in a new version of the Flash from some parallel universe, but rather to explain the existence of an old one. The comic explained that two objects can occupy the same space and time if they vibrate at different speeds, and apparently there was a second Earth with a different vibration, and that Earth was the year 1940. The writers of Flash number 123 created this second Earth to explain the fact that there were two Flashes with two different stories. In 1940, The Flash was debuted as a guy named Jay Garrick, a college student who wore what looked like a metal bowl on his head. But in 1956, DC reintroduced The Flash as Barry Allen, with the iconic costume that has lasted to this day as The One. It was difficult to explain these conflicting narratives, so the writers of Flash 123 came up with a plan. The golden age of comics back in the 30s and 40s would be Earth 2. The silver age, which began in the 50s, would be Earth 1. Depending on how you look at it, it's either a very creative solution or a total cop-out. Either way, this solution to explaining away different timelines within DC's universe became common practice. The floodgates were open, and some writers took the idea of infinite Earths way too far, turning the DC multiverse into a minefield of stories and characters that all had to be explained into this complicated system of Earths. At a certain point, it became too much, and the multiverse looked more like an Earth soup. The stories were too connected to each other, and the writers had to keep long lists so they wouldn't step on another story's toes. But they kept going, writing stories on Earth Prime, Earth 4, Earth 127, and more until writer and editor Marv Wolfman got a letter. Wolfman was editing Green Lantern at the time, and according to the fan who wrote in, he'd made a continuity mistake. A character met Green Lantern in a 1981 issue and didn't recognize him, even though they'd met in another issue 3 years earlier. Wolfman realized that he and the rest of DC had some cleaning up to do. He explained the position he'd found himself in. Writers like to complicate matters, and what began as a dream of a story, Flash of Two Worlds, had turned into a nightmare. DC continuity was so confusing, no new reader could easily understand it, while older readers had to keep miles-long lists to set things straight. And the writers, well, we were always stumbling over each other trying to figure out simple answers to difficult questions. And so the seed of Crisis on Infinite Earths was planted. Wolfman described his intentions for the series in the back of the 4th issue of Crisis. For the past several years, many people have suggested fixing up the DC universe, simplifying it, making it consistent yet in a way which would not prevent experiments that varied with an established future. Other writers and artists have often mentioned how they wish the morass of continuity could be repaired. Well, Crisis on Infinite Earths will attempt such a repair job. By series end, DC will have a consistent and more easily understandable universe to play with. We're pulling out all stops to make Crisis on Infinite Earths an epic you will never forget. Wolfman and the other editors began planning the crossover as far back as 1983, planting subtle and not so subtle hints in all sorts of different DC stories. They already had an idea of what they wanted to do with the Crisis plot. They sent memos to all their writers, instructing them to insert a new character called the Monitor into their stories. And so began the build-up to Crisis. So what is the Crisis story? Although the idea was to clean up the DC continuity and make it more accessible for its readers and writers, this didn't exactly pan out. Relaying the plot here would be impossible and futile. Instead, we'll just go over some of the main plot points. Here's how it started. In the beginning, there was only one, a single black infinitude, so cold and dark for so very long that even the burning light was imperceptible. But the light grew and the infinitude shuddered, and the darkness finally screamed, as much in pain as in relief. For in that instant, a multiverse was born. A multiverse of worlds vibrating and replicating, and a multiverse that should have been one became many. So there's this Big Bang event, the explosive genesis of the multiverse. The moment is the result of an alien named Krona, like a Scandinavian currency, trying to find the secrets at the dawn of time. His meddling causes the one universe to split apart into many. Aside from creating a bunch of timelines, Krona's experimentation also created the Monitor, who, well, monitors the universe. Unfortunately, that's only the good side. Krona also created an antimatter universe complete with its own anti-monitor, who, instead of watching over all these worlds, tries to destroy them. But he's trapped in a galactic prison, so he's harmless. But then another scientist comes along, the aptly named Pariah, and he has the same idea as Krona. He tries to go back and uncover the secrets at ground zero of the multiverse's Big Bang, and unfortunately he sets the anti-monitor free, who then goes on an all-powerful intergalactic version of Mailbox Baseball, destroying worlds like it's going out of style. At this point, the story gets very complicated, so let's skip to the end. The anti-monitor gets his way and destroys the whole multiverse and travels once again back to the dawn of time, where he's met by the DC equivalent of the 1992 USA Olympic basketball team. The DC All-Stars battle it out and of course end up defeating the Anti-Monitor. And so the many universes are restored to one, and Marv Wolfman gets to rewrite those first lines, but with a twist. In the beginning there were many, a multiversal infinitude, so cold and dark for so very long that even the burning light was imperceptible. But the light grew and the multiverse shuddered, and the darkness screamed as much in pain as in relief. For in that instant, a universe was born. A universe with mighty worlds orbiting burning suns. A universe reborn at the dawn of time. What had been many became one. If you haven't caught on already, the story of Crisis is a tidy metaphor for the whole history of DC. From its Big Bang genesis to its increasing complexity, to its mixed up, incomprehensible stage, to the huge event that ends everything and restarts it as one simple narrative. But obviously this was way too good to be true. There was no way a publisher as big as DC would just wipe the slate clean for its dozens of different series. But there were some changes. A lot of characters got rebooted in the wake of the big event with new worlds, backstories, and origins, but also a new tone. The DC comics that came out after Crisis had, for the most part, one thing in common. That being, they were all much darker, more violent, and more morally ambiguous than the brightly colored camp that had come before. Titles like Killing Joke, Watchmen, and a bit later, Kingdom Come, recast DC as the serious publisher, an image that they're associated with to this day. So, to sum all that up, DC had a problem on their hand. They'd copped out to infinity with their multiple Earth theory and had lost control of all their narrative strands. If they were going to keep selling comics, they would have to create a simpler, less alienating DC universe. But obviously this was way too good to be true. There was no way a publisher as big as DC would just wipe the slate clean for its dozens of different series. But there were some changes. A lot of characters got rebooted in the wake of the big event with new worlds, backstories, and origins, but also a new tone. The DC comics that came out after Crisis had, for the most part, one thing in common. That being, they were all much darker, more violent, and more morally ambiguous than the brightly colored camp that had come before. Titles like Killing Joke, Watchmen, and a bit later, Kingdom Come, recast DC as the serious publisher, an image that they're associated with to this day. So, to sum all that up, DC had a problem on their hand. They'd copped out to infinity with their multiple Earth theory and had lost control of all their narrative strands. If they were going to keep selling comics, they would have to create a simpler, less alienating DC universe. So they created Crisis as a way to rationalize all the flailing tentacles of their different universes, bringing them all together in one story and then blowing them up and starting fresh, or at least trying to. So, what does all this mean for the Arrowverse? DC's TV and film properties look a lot like their comics did before Crisis on Infinite Earths. They vary drastically in tone, their stories are often outrageous, and save for a few outliers, they aren't getting much critical acclaim. There's a totally standalone Joker movie, 2 different Batmans in the past decade, and a new Batman trilogy that's supposed to begin this year. They haven't been able to settle on a tone, much less an actor to play Superman, and the rest of their characters are just not quite up to snuff. Yet. The Arrowverse is plagued even more than the movies are by these issues. It's fun, but it's also campy and very convoluted. So this year's Arrowverse crossover might be the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new one, where TV and movies are unified, consistent, and high quality. Think about it, they're bringing in a Superman from a 10-year-old TV show, and one from a 13-year-old movie, while keeping the one they already have. They're getting the guy who played Robin from the 1960s, and the guy who has voiced Batman in cartoons and video games since the early 90s. Add to that the fact that at least one of the main characters has been pretty much guaranteed to die. The demise of Oliver Queen, or Green Arrow, has been foreshadowed like it's nobody's business, and killing him off would make sense because his show is ending. Huntress, who's crossing over from an ill-fated early 2000s TV series, was killed off in the comics and will most likely be killed off here. The Barry Allen Flash was also dusted in the comics, but ending him in the show might prove more complicated, as there are plans for a 7th season. But at the same time, Flash's viewership has been in steady decline since it premiered 5 years ago. So who's to say? Also, the Monitor and Anti-Monitor are played by an iconic slam ball legend. If he gets killed off, which he will, then anyone can. This has the potential to be the big reboot that DC needs. How far do you think they'll take Crisis on Infinite Earths? Will all these shows just end? Or will they continue on in their own convoluted ways? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to The Binger for everything you need to know about the upcoming Crisis.